Welcome to Eternal Elements Learning Podcast, brought to you by Atyasa Online. These podcasts are a part of the audio certificate programs on Atyasa Online. You're free to take these podcasts on your desired portal also, should you only wish to learn on the go. Thank you so much for engaging on these podcasts, and you can connect with the author on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Welcome back. This is Niket Karaski from Eternal Elements, brought to you by Atyasa Online. We are in Season 8 talking about international business, and we are in the defining moment in this podcast in terms of what led to globalization. I talked about the pre-World War I era, and I talked about the interwar era. I also talked about the fact that World War II saw massive destruction. We also talked about the Great Depression. Emerging from the challenge of the destruction of World War II was a very, very daunting task. The only way out was economic cooperation and forgetting the fact that nations need to be on war in order to ensure economic stability. The mercantilist approach was not working at all. And that's when United States and Great Britain came together and started talking to each other. This shaped up the Bretton Woods Conference, formerly known as the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Side by side, in order to preserve the world peace, United Nations as an intergovernmental organization was also being formulated. However, the Bretton Woods Conference was a gathering of 730 odd delegates from 44 allied nations at the Mount Washington Hotel situated in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, United States. It came in to regulate the international monetary and financial order after the conclusion of World War II. When we talk about the international monetary and financial order, we're typically talking about restructuring of economies, restructuring of the way the trade was happening, and restructuring of the way the currencies were being exchanged between the countries. The Bretton Woods Conference is a defining moment in terms of the global trade. This conference was held from July 1 to 22nd July 1944. There were agreements that were signed, and after legislative ratification by the member governments, they established the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or the IBRD. It became the part of the World Bank Group. And they also created the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. This was what was the Bretton Woods system for international commercial financial relations, and they're also called the Bretton Woods Twins. What is the background for this? After the Second World War, John Keynes and Harry White, John Keynes of the British Treasury and Harry White of the United States Treasury Department, independently started building on this idea of Bretton Woods Twins. After negotiations is when this entire aspect of the World Bank Group, the IBRD, and the IMF came into being. The role of the IBRD was to help nations to reconstruct themselves and emerge from the destruction of the war, whereas the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, was a subscription-based order where nations had to put in money, and the prosperity of the other economies was therefore going to be taken care of. So the rich nations were to contribute money, and it was supposed to help the nations which were completely destroyed in terms of their infrastructure, in terms of the economies, to be supported. And by the way, there were a lot of colonies, which were the third world countries also, which had to be brought into the system in terms of the economic reordering. Now, the critical component of the Bretton Woods system and the creation of the Bretton Woods Twins was IMF carried the responsibility of creating policies to ensure that the economies of different countries would come to speed. When they come up to speed, obviously they need money. So the bank would provide money and the IMF would create policy. That was the whole idea. But there was one more important thing that happened during the Bretton Woods Convention. And that was Earlier, there was something called the gold standard, where money, the currency, was pegged to the quantum of gold that the country held, and the adjustment was only possible if there was a fundamental disequilibrium between the currency and the gold. In this convention, what was decided was that currencies were to be made convertible, and they would be now moving into free markets in terms of being operated on demand and supply. That means the currencies had to be made freely convertible. Dollar was the strongest currency at that point in time because obviously America, the economy, was doing great. And therefore, a lot of countries also decided to peg their currencies to the dollar. This is a very interesting phenomenon because what it created was a world order of trade which would happen purely in terms of dollar. That means any business that would happen all over the world, it would happen in dollar. And therefore, dollar started becoming strong. Nevertheless, the European countries also came together and made their currencies convertible. And for the first time, we were moving into the direction of economic cooperation between countries. This was the defining moment of globalization because this was only possible after the barriers to trade were eliminated and open markets were being encouraged. And that's what happened at the Bretton Woods Conference. There was the notion of open markets that came into being. I personally feel, as a student of the history of economics, World War II was the defining moment of globalization. After that, once the countries started cooperating with each other, the mercantilist approach dropped and the free trade theories started finding velocity in the global market space. I will now talk about in my subsequent podcast what happened post Bretton Woods Conference. There were interesting organizations that got created. United Nations came into being. The World Bank Group was there. Also, the GATT came into being, and we shall now talk about GATT in the podcast, which is scheduled next for you. GATT was the defining moment of opening up the world order completely for international business. And in international business, therefore, it's so important to study GATT. And then the movement of GATT into WTO. We shall talk about all that. Thank you very much. This is Niket Karasgi signing off from Eternal Elements on this podcast. I'll speak to you in the next podcast. See you soon.